All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I am Marty Oberman, Chairman of the Surface Transportation Board, and we called this conference today to announce and discuss the board's decision approving the acquisition of Kansas City Southern by Canadian Pacific, a matter which has been pending before the board for some approximately 2 years. We made this decision because we found, in general terms, which I will discuss in more detail, that on balance, the merger of these two railroads will benefit the American economy and will be an improvement for all citizens in terms of safety and the environment. Before we get into a discussion of those details, I wanted to make a few general comments. I have been reliably informed by board staff that this is the first press conference the STB has ever had, or at least has ever had in recent memory. I'm not entirely surprised, but this board, since its coming together over 2 years ago, has been committed to transparency and accountability. And we all concluded that on a decision of this magnitude, it was essential to be available to the public to explain the importance and the merits of this decision, to answer questions, and to be held accountable, which is why we're here today. And I would anticipate there'll be more such opportunities in the future when major matters come up. Before getting into the merits, I want to point out that in the 2 years this matter has been pending, we have received over 2,000 comments from interested citizens, public officials, rail customers, and other rail carriers. We held 7 community hearings throughout the affected area of Chicago, Iowa, Houston, Kansas City. Those meetings were for a central part of our extensive environmental review. They were attended by at least 2 board members. I attended every one, and another board member came to each one. We heard from hundreds of concerned citizens. We also held a 7-day public hearing by the board last fall, in which many, many more people participated. And I want to thank all the members of the public and interested stakeholders who took the time to communicate to us, tell us their concerns, write written comments. We are a public agency charged with pursuing the public interest. We cannot do our job without as much public input as the public wants to give us. And so I want to thank everybody who made those efforts to participate. But I also want to single out board staff. Reviewing a merger, and this is the first major one in 25 years, is a massive undertaking. Tens of thousands of what would be, if they weren't electronic, pages of data are submitted and have to be analyzed and scrutinized. We issued a 175-page single-space decision with extensive appendices. This doesn't happen without the highly professional work of our lawyers, economists, other rail experts, and all the staff at this board, many of whom worked around the clock in recent weeks to finalize this decision and to make sure, most importantly, that the 5 board members were well informed of the facts and details and policies that we needed to assess before reaching our decision. So I want to extend as much praise as I possibly can to board staff for enabling us to reach what the board majority concludes is a very, very sound and important decision. I'd like to make a few general observations, talk about a few specifics in the decision, and then, as long as you have stamina, I will try to answer your questions. The Congress has set up a statutory scheme for consideration of rail mergers that is unique to this industry. It charged the STB with sole legal authority to review and approve or disapprove rail mergers. And it set forth a number of crucial policy measures that we are required to assess when considering a rail merger. And so everything that we do here has to be measured against the backdrop of what is our congressional mandate. And I won't trouble you with the entire statute, but there are a couple of key points that need to be kept in mind as we discuss the details of this proposed merger. Excuse me for 1 minute. Could somebody give me a little water? I meant to bring a bottle in and I forgot. Roberta will do it. She's fast. Thanks, Roberta. One, we are supposed to consider the proposed transaction, the effect of the proposed transaction on the adequacy of transportation to the public. So this is different than in most antitrust laws because there is a pro-transportation policy component to reviewing mergers. We are supposed to consider whether the transaction will have an adverse effect on competition. That is also in the statute. But both of these concepts are exceptionally important when considering the nature of the rail industry. Ultimately, the Congress has mandated us to approve mergers when we find that the transaction, quote, is consistent with the public interest, which the courts have interpreted as a broad mandate for us to look at all aspects of the impacts of proposed mergers. Those are key concepts that we must be mindful of and which guided the board in reaching this decision. So let me talk a little bit about the specifics. The two railroads involved here are the smallest of the Class 1 railroads. So if you consider these railroads separately, you have Kansas City Southern, with which, if you add up all the mileage in the United States and in the subsidiary it owns in Mexico, and trackage rights, has 7,000 route miles. CP, if you do the same thing, has about 13,000 route miles. These railroads are up against primarily the Western giant railroads, Burlington Northern and Union Pacific, which have more than 32,000 route miles. One of the underlying factors that we found in this merger is that putting these two small railroads together will actually provide a stronger competitive landscape in the rail industry vis-a-vis these much larger railroads, because separately they do not, excuse me. Okay, that's awesome. I'll just take the bottle. Thank you. Pardon me. Separately, these railroads just do not have the same oomph and power in providing competitive service as we have found they will together. And I think that's an important point to keep in mind. It is not the main reason or even the sole reason or even the main reason for our decision, but it is an aspect of the rail network that we have to consider. And I know there's been a great deal of talk, including by me over the time I've been on the board, about the consolidation in the rail industry over the last 30 years. There's certainly an ongoing debate about whether there's been too much consolidation, and I might personally, not speaking for the board, have such a view. But that consolidation presented the landscape on which we are acting today. And we have to act in what is in the best interest of the country as a whole when considering such a transaction. So we found that because of the creation of a stronger competitive force, that when considering the adequacy of transportation, and to quote one of our other statutes, to ensure, quote, the development and continuation of a sound rail transportation system, we found that putting these two railroads together at this point in the country's history will accomplish that. One of the key aspects of this merger, which is different from all past mergers that I'm aware of, is that it is end to end. The routes of CP and KCS do not overlap. They do not serve the same origins and destinations. So there will be no loss of a parallel competitive route by putting these two railroads together. That is a central fact of this decision and a central fact on which I believe the board relied. Because for certain, the board would not approve a decision which had the effect of diminishing competition. But to ensure that there's no diminution in competition, we have enacted unprecedentedly strong gateway protections. Gateways are places in the rail network where two railroads come together and they interchange traffic to get from one place to the other if the railroad doesn't go all the way. That is a key aspect nationwide of how the rail system works. There are many places currently that CP and KCS serve that connect through gateways where today shippers have options at the gateway on how to get their service to the ultimate destination or to get it from the original origin. This decision imposes a requirement that all of those gateways remain open on the same open terms that exist today without the merger. And we imposed very stringent supervision of that requirement so that it is complied with. There will be detailed reporting, and I'll talk about the reporting in a moment. But the concern, and it was raised at the hearings, that a railroad in CP's position could use manipulation of rates to, in effect, foreclose traffic to keep shippers from having options by how they set their rates, a realistic concern even in an end-to-end merger. We established a heretofore never established procedure whereby if the railroad attempts to raise a gateway rate higher than the rate of inflation, the shipper can demand and is required to be provided a written justification from the railroad with the specifics of how such a rate is commercially reasonable. And once that is in writing, the railroad can't change its position. And if it doesn't pass muster, the shipper can come directly to the board on an expedited hearing basis and challenge that rate. And that's important for those of you who follow the rail industry, because normally our rate review mechanism is very cumbersome, very time consuming, very expensive. And this procedure is intended to be a very fast and economical way for a shipper to ensure that the open gateway commitment and for the board to enforce the open gateway commitment and ensure that it is adhered to. That's very important on the competition front. Because of the benefits to the economy, and there will be substantial, we believe, from this merger. Single line service between Canada through the United States to Mexico will enhance trade, enhance productivity, enhance shipper opportunities to expand their own businesses. That was one of the key factors that led us to find that this merger is in the public interest. And it is not surprising that over 450 shippers, the people who we have been worried about for years as being the victims of too much concentration and monopoly power, 450 shippers, filed statements of support for this merger. Who opposed the merger? Primarily on the business side, the other Class 1 carriers. And it was clear from their filings that what they were trying to do was to either stop the merger or to put conditions which so favored them and so shifted the financial benefits to them to make the merger unattractive and unworkable to CP and KCS. And we rejected those efforts for that reason. I want to talk about safety and the environment for a moment. It's no secret, and we are well aware of the very real and legitimate public concern over rail safety. That's always been there, but certainly has come to the fore as a result of the derailment in East Palestine. And we've heard from many people, members of Congress, concerned citizens, people fearful for their own neighborhoods. Now, in fact, it is a routine part of the board's consideration of rail acquisitions to review the safety aspects of the transaction. And so we were all already well underway in reviewing, documenting, measuring what the aspects are, the safety aspects of this transaction. So let me try to address a few examples, particularly on the transportation of hazardous materials. If there is a problem in this country about the safe transportation of hazardous materials on rail, and there is some problem, obviously, safety can and must always be improved, and zero accidents should be what we strive for. It is a problem nationwide. It is not a problem caused or the result of this merger. In fact, to the extent hazardous materials can be moved on rail rather than on the highways, we are better off the more of that traffic that is moved to rail. The Bureau of Transportation Statistics documented last year, and it's been pretty consistent over the years, that 94% of all hazardous material problems, incidents, spills, 94% occur on truck. Only 1% have occurred on rail. So if you were trying to make sure that communities all over the country were safer, you would want, as we do, to move more of this material by train rather than by truck. And I think we have to be very realistic when we talk about what are these hazardous materials. Yes, they're very hazardous. Many of them are the foundation of our economy. Plastic bags in the supermarket, the steering wheel on your car, the equipment that's up here on this podium are all made from plastics, which are made from hazardous materials, which are moved around by trains. So no one is suggesting that we simply stop moving hazardous materials altogether, because that would shut down our economy and most of the things that we need every day. Nothing is without risk. When we walk out of the door every morning across the street, there's some risk, but we don't stop walking across the street. So the goal is for those charged with safety, which is essentially the FRA and the railroads themselves, oversee the safety and ensure that the public is safe. But this merger, of which we've received a lot of talk about safety, will in fact enhance safety. And I'd just like to point out a few of the details that we scrutinized in the data that was reviewed for this transaction. We looked at a period of 5 years from 2015 to 2019. That's the database we looked at. During that time period, and just take Chicago for an example, but this affects all the communities, CP moved 60 million car miles of hazardous materials through the Chicago area. There was not one car hazardous spill during that period. Safe. There was one leak of 10 gallons of diesel fuel from a locomotive in a rail yard, and that gets reported as a hazardous spill. So rail is and can be extraordinarily safe. And that is just one example. In fact, when you look at the safety records of all the Class 1 railroads, CP has the safest record, and KCS is just behind it. So if this merger results, as the applicants say it will, in the diversion not only of trucks, but of traffic from other railroads to CP, ultimately the country will benefit because the materials will be moving on a safer railroad. There will also be a significant benefit to the environment. There is no contest that moving freight by rail is far more environmentally friendly than moving it by truck. There's detailed data that will give you all of the measurements you want. But we look specifically at the 64,000 truckloads annually that are expected to be moved off of the highways and onto the new combined rail system. And if you just look at those 64,000 truckloads, you're looking at a saving of 127,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year that will not be put into the environment. That is a meaningful gain for the benefit of the public in general. And I'm happy during the question period to go into any more details on this, but I want to get through a few points quickly so that we could get to your questions. Passenger rail, a key duty of this board to oversee and protect in many ways, and certainly a key initiative of the current administration, one which we support, is important. CP has the best on-time performance record for Amtrak trains of all the class ones on their lines. And in fact, Amtrak came before this board and supports this merger. Two reasons, I think, in addition to the on-time performance, is that there are some brand new routes in the South, in Baton Rouge, and I believe in Texas, which CP has committed to opening up to Amtrak trains. There are a number of additional Amtrak routings that we're already committed to that will be going over CP lines. And as part of this merger, CP committed, and we conditioned that those commitments are honored and that the additional Amtrak trains are facilitated. Metra raised a number of concerns, and we heard those concerns, but the data that we reviewed do not establish at this point that there should be any interference with Metra trains on the lines on which CP also runs. But as part of our oversight, and we'll talk a little bit more of the oversight in a moment, there will be detailed scrutiny of the interaction between Metra and CP, detailed reporting of metrics, detailed analysis of train length and on-time performance. And as part of our oversight period, the board will stand ready to enter any further orders that the facts on the ground warrant to make sure that Metra does not have adverse impacts from this merger. Employment. The data presented to the board showed that there will expected to be 800 new union jobs created as a result of the merger in the United States, and I believe another 200 in Canada. There will be some white collar jobs lost at headquarters in Kansas City, I think 112 or something like that. But overall, there will be a net gain in employment, and the board has included what it does in any acquisition, the so-called New York Dock conditions, which protect working people on railroads who may be impacted by the merger. So I want to talk for a moment about the oversight provisions because they are essential. Many of the concerns that we heard from affected communities, Chicago and Houston, Davenport, Dubuque, Kansas City, and other parts of this route, really boiled down to an understandable skepticism and indeed cynicism, which I think many citizens, including me, feel across this country towards large institutions and towards government. In reviewing a merger, we require the applicants to submit a tremendous amount of data. And this data, for the most part, is data that is recorded and kept in the ordinary course of business by railroads. We require a great deal of reporting even outside the context of a merger. The data we get from the railroads is generally verifiable to some degree. We have remarkable data experts in our economic office who are constantly studying data we get from railroads. And in a merger situation, and this is one of the reasons it takes 2 years to review a merger, the data is gone over in great detail. And in fact, some of you may recall that over a year ago or so, some issues were raised about discrepancy in data, and we required additional filings so we could iron out those discrepancies. But ultimately, the board found that the data that was presented to us by the railroads was reasonable and was reliable on which we could base this decision. Many of the concerned citizens and local public officials who communicated to us basically are saying, well, we don't trust the data. We think they've overstated it or understated it. We're concerned, we're fearful. I'm sympathetic to those concerns. But we are required to process a transaction that's brought before us on the data that we find to be reliable. But the data, much of which involves not only historical data, but projections on what the impact of the merger will be on the number of trains, the length of trains, block crossings, et cetera, are future projections. And I don't think it's going too far afield to quote one of our favorites, Yogi Berra, predictions are difficult, especially about the future. This is why we have instituted an unprecedented 7-year oversight period. In the past, the board's never had an oversight period longer than 5 years. But as an extra measure, one that was a particular concern to me, and the board agreed, we wanted to extend that oversight period. During the oversight period, if the fears of the affected communities come to fruition, if there's more interference with Metro, if there are more block crossings, if there are safety concerns that we do not project to be there now, the board stands ready. It has the explicit statutory authority to hear those complaints, and if the facts are established, to enter further orders to make sure that these communities and these other railroads like Metro are protected. That is the sensible way to go about this. And so there is a detailed, very detailed, more detailed than in history, reporting requirements. So the reporting will cover, and this is all laid out in the decision and in the appendix. The reporting will cover car loads that are going through gateways, so we can measure whether there's been any attempt to foreclose and stifle competition compared to historical levels of car loads, as one example. The data reporting will allow us to measure whether the promises of 64,000 truck to rail conversions is in fact taking place, whether the number of rail to rail conversions from other railroads to CP, KC is taking place. We will have access to, if needed, their 100% traffic tapes. That is every piece of data that the railroad possibly has. We will have, if needed. Will be requiring them to set up a protocol. So if a question or a pattern of unfair rate increases is brought to our attention, we can require the railroad to give us a list of all their rate increases over that gateway over a period of time. If service is negatively impacted, and we don't expect that it will be, we expect it will be improved. CP, KC will be required to come up with a service plan to rectify those, which will be overseen by us. Important to many communities, we will be getting regular reports on the number of trains per day, the length of those trains, which is not something currently measured by board data requirements, so that if the projections turn out not to be accurate, we can act. And I wanted to mention specifically something about train length, because I know it was mentioned yesterday in the Washington Post. The data is that the average train length after this merger is expected to decrease, not increase. The current average train length on the CP network is 9,500 feet. After the merger, it's projected to be reduced by some 1,800 feet to 7,700 feet. These are about the shortest trains that are now running, other than local trains. There is a projection in, I think, the Chicago suburbs about somewhat longer trains going through some of the towns, but the numbers are minimal. The average increase in train length in the Chicago suburbs will be 349 feet. That's about 10 cars. It's 5,600 feet now on average. It's projected to increase to just under 6,000 feet, 5,900 feet. So there's been a lot of fear and concern about train length, but the numbers show that this is not projected to be an actual problem in these communities. But if it is, we will know, because we will have the precise data to measure it. So, excuse me for one moment, folks. To conclude, in our role, which is essentially to oversee and ensure a healthy and robust rail network, 30 to 40% of the United States economy depends on a well-functioning railroad. This is the reason you have heard me and my fellow board members railing about some of the rail service problems and issues that have affected the rail industry, at least since I've been on the board, and we are working hard to fix it. But our assignment is to fix it and to ensure a robust rail transportation network. We found that this merger will enhance the creation of a robust rail network, ultimately one that will be safe and environmentally friendly, and that is why we approved it. With that, I'm happy to take your questions. And you know what? You have to tell me who you are, so I know I'm talking to.
Yeah, Daniel DeRoche with Kansas City Star.
Yes, sir.
So, you know, we talked to some folks at Ranch, Iowa about the concerns that they had. And, you know, as you mentioned, train length and you know, stopping, crossing is one of them. You know, you said in here that the stoppages will not be longer than 10 minutes in these towns.
Correct.
That's one of the requirements. But, and then you'll take action if you have data that shows that it's going longer. What would that action look? Would you, I mean, so I imagine you would be able to feel like murder. What would you be requiring the trains to do, or the company to do, to actually follow through with what the promise?
It's almost impossible to answer that question in the vacuum. What is the cause of the stoppage? Was it some unusual weather condition that stopped all trains everywhere? Was it some internal operating plan in which the railroad decided we don't care about stoppages anymore, just ignore it? I mean, what's causing it? And then that would dictate the appropriate action to be taken.
Yeah,
but you know, the blockage of rail crossings is a very problematic issue in this country, because local governments do not have authority to regulate it. And outside of the context of a merger, neither do we. It's a vacuum that Congress needs to fill, because every community has concerns about block crossings. There will be block crossings unless the government decides to spend trillions of dollars of building overpasses, and they're not cheap overpasses. And there are places where that should be done. It's being done in some places in Chicago. 10 minutes has become sort of standard. CP pledged to adhere to that, and we impose that as a condition, subject to you know, unavoidable events. So all I can tell you is that if a pattern occurs that is harming a community and it is brought to us, we will get the facts. And if it can be remedied, and we have broad powers to fashion remedies, we'll do it. But I couldn't, it'd be irresponsible to start guessing about what kind of order we might issue. Yes, sir.
Hi, we both seem to be American Oversight.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so the Surface Transportation Board received a complaint that was calling for to investigate a meeting that Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern held at a hotel in Palm Beach in February. And several attendants of the meeting believed that there was improper information exchanged between the two merging firms, basically acting as though the deal had already come through. I'm curious if the board looked into that complaint and how big of an issue you believe it is if these two firms were acting as if the deal had come through.
Well, I'm not actually aware today, but I'll try to find out for you before this is over, what the status of whatever the board has looked into. It hasn't come to the board members' attention. I'm aware of the press reports of the meeting. I don't know what happened at the meeting. If you look at our voting trust decision that we issued 2 years ago, we required the placement of an independent trustee who controls basically the operation of Kansas City Southern during the pendency of the merger. We had an unquestioned candidate for that position, the late David Starling, who functioned in that role until just unfortunately a couple of weeks ago when he suddenly passed away. So that meeting happened while he was still a trustee. By the way, Mr. Starling was promptly replaced by the former head of the FRA, Ron Vittori, who was also unquestionably qualified for that job, we found. But if you look at the voting trust decision, Kansas City Southern and CP, apart from any merger, are railroads like every other railroad in this country that interchange with each other every day. They have to be able to communicate operational matters, rate divisions, and so forth that are part of the routine exchange of business between independent railroads. And we noted that while there could not be any collusion pre-ruling on the merger as if they were one railroad, that we acknowledged they had to be able to talk to each other to function. I do not know the subject matter of any meeting, but I think it's the requirement was not a ban on any discussion between those two railroads. The system would shut down. We wouldn't have a functioning rail network if they couldn't talk to each other for 2 years. So I just keep that in mind. But what exactly went on there, I don't have an answer for. This young lady at the end, yes.
Hi, Karen James Sloan with CNBC.
Yes, ma'am.
I understand you said you did 5 years of, or you took a look at 5 years of research, 5 years of
Data. But that was the database that I believe our staff had CP provide to us.
Okay, 5 years. Do you think that you need to do additional analysis? How confident are you in your analysis about increased freight traffic and with it increased safety risks that some have argued would result from this merger? Do you think you need to go farther than 5 years?
Well, 5 years is a pretty long time. The rail industry is forever evolving. So if you said, well, maybe it changed 6 months later, then we would be here for 50 years. We're charged with making a decision. Actually, the Congress mandated a decision date in this case of January 19th. They also mandated that we could not rule until the environmental impact statement was completed. Two directly conflicting statutes. Thank you, Congress. And so that wasn't completed till February 3rd. So we could not even issue this decision, even if we're ready. And we couldn't be ready till we review the environmental matters till 30 days after March 3rd. At some point, government has to function. It cannot forever review additional data that comes in. That is the reason for the oversight period. 5 years is a very long time to measure the operations of a railroad and to make reasonably reliable projections about what we expect it to bring. People have said to us, hold off on the merger, study the data further. I'm confident in saying this data cannot be studied any further. It has been studied until your eyeballs are falling out. I can bring in our economics analysts in here, and they would tell you, I can't do anymore. So I appreciate people saying, look further. We have looked with excruciating detail, and the safety data is, some of which I summarized to you, is there. And it's just not that there is no fear of, there is no factual basis to conclude that the merger will worsen safety. The factual data shows that it will improve safety for every community and for Americans as a whole. That's the best data that's there. That data is not going to differ if we studied another 6 months or another year.
Yeah.
All right. I mean, I think one way to look at it is that CP was not running the train in East Palestine. If it was, maybe there'd be a reason to re-examine. CP's record is the opposite. Yes, ma'am.
Tanya Steiner, Politico. Can you say a little bit more about what will happen at the end? What changes at the end of the 7-year oversight period? It sounds like you're collecting more data, but the authorities of the board to address any problems that you see arise are the same authorities that you already have and the same authorities that you will have, although you are talking about expediting the rate review period, which I assume.
Good question. Few points. Number one, explicitly in the decision, we have provided that if the facts warrant it, we will extend the oversight period at the end of 7 years. So it depends how these railroads are behaving, and that option will be there. Let me answer it broadly and then get back to the specifics. I think one thing to keep in mind when the STB reviews a merger of railroads as compared to other mergers in other industries that get reviewed by the Justice Department, we are a regulatory agency. We oversee the kinds of issues that are brought to us by this merger every day: competition, service failures, and so forth, as it relates to smooth flow of traffic, congestion, and so forth. Those are part of our everyday obligation under our statutes. So I think part of your question is, you are right that we will continue our general oversight function long after the 7 years, even if these two railroads behave like saints during the 7-year period, that we're not going to go away. I'm going to go a little beyond now what's in the decision. I'm going to speak for myself. I want that clear. I have 4 very other independent and smart board members who speak for themselves. Although I think we're pretty much on the same wavelength. We, as a board, have been very concerned about the conduct in the rail industry since we've been here, and certainly in the last 2 years. We have a number of other measures pending, which we think are crucial to deal with to improve competition, improve rail service. Those efforts are going to go on, and they will affect every railroad, including this new merged railroad, so that they will be part of whatever regulatory scheme the board devises. I think the difference is that in the merger context, the statute and the courts have explicitly stated that our conditioning authority and our ability to enter appropriate orders is even broader than our usual statutory authority. And so that is why the oversight period is crucial, and why extending it, if needed, will be crucial, because we will have more authority to intervene if needed. So I can't tell you exactly when it will end. It will depend on the facts on the ground at the time. But I think the bottom line is that this board will be here to ensure the public interest is protected. Now, I can't say who will be on the board 7 years from now. It sure won't be me. But I anticipate we will have, this has been a pretty responsible organization over the years. Some people might disagree with that. Certainly the current board is terrific in my view, including me. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about the gateway.
Tell me who you are.
Oh, sorry. Abby Kaplan with Real Business.
Yes, ma'am.
About your gateway provision.
Yes.
Are you considering expanding this beyond CPKC? I mean, I know the board has been very involved in trying to modify its rail rate regulations.
Gotta speak for myself.
It would be a game changer.
Got to speak for myself on this one. Very good question. If you watched any of our public hearings on this subject, and I was just looking for my, here it is. Several of the major railroads, including BN and UP, at the hearings asked us to not only institute these kinds of gateway protections, but to go even further in terms of bottleneck rules and ensuring openness and so forth, way beyond what the current law is. And I asked them, only slightly facetiously, were they asking us to eliminate the bottleneck rule for everybody? It's what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. I didn't get any positive responses from those large railroads. In my view, and I have been saying this repeatedly, we need to take measures to improve, to the extent it can be done in this very consolidated industry, the status of competition. And I think all measures which would open up competition ought to be looked at. As you know, we have pending, and now that this work on this merger has been completed, I personally can start devoting more attention to it. The long pending so-called 7-Eleven rule dealing with reciprocal switching, which is centrally related to these issues about competitive access. And I do think, I can't say that these gateway commitments are the way to go for the entire industry, but the concept of providing more competition and more access to competing railroads is centrally on this board's table. And it's certainly on high at the top of my agenda. But it would be premature to say, well, this kind of gateway protection is the way to go for the whole industry. Conceptually, you're in the same arena when we're talking about protecting these competitive options. Yes.
Chris May, Alex,
With
Alex. Sort of two questions. One is this the last merger we'll see between the Class 1 railroads in the future? And I say that as there's a few unique aspects of the decision to review this merger, including waiver of 2001 major merger standards, both the trust as well. So we expect to see any future the other question is, you mentioned all measures that the local competition will be looked at. I understand that STB has a different mandate than say DOJ or FTC, but what we've seen with previous mergers through despite concerns about competition, now they're going back in some cases asking for some of these mergers to be broken up. Is that even conceivable? Talking about the industry.
Well, you know, I am one who says that nothing is inconceivable, but the idea of trying to separate UP and SP and Missouri Pacific 30 or 40 years after they've been integrated. I mean, I don't fault you for asking the question. It's not a serious idea. Somebody else wants to undertake that. It's not here. You know, the railroad industry is very different from almost every other kind of business. If you think of other businesses, cell phones, it's feasible to build another cell tower with more antenna on it someplace. It is not feasible to build for a new railroad to build 2,000 miles of track from Chicago to Los Angeles. That is never going to happen. So you have to consider the nature, the physical nature of this industry when asking those kinds of questions. I'm speaking for myself. It might be in some ideal world that maybe some of the past consolidations were too much. I suppose the other way to answer that question, even if it was a good idea to break up the railroads, you want to take that on? You want to figure out which railroad should own these tracks and which railroad? I mean, it really, that is really something that is ideally suited for the private sector to figure out. The question of whether there will be any other Class 1 mergers, I can say with great confidence, not right now because nobody's filed one, and they take years to pursue. Let me try to answer the question this way. The real answer is, if an application comes in, we'll review it at the time and we'll scrutinize it very carefully. And it is really irresponsible to speak in the hypothetical. But if you look at the facts of this merger, KCS is by far the smallest of the Class 1 railroads. Many people regard it as a large Class 2. The only railroad on the planet that had an end-to-end connection with KCS was CP. No other railroad was in that physical relationships to KCS. Those are the reasons. I'm oversimplifying because we spelled this out in detail in our voting trust decisions and our prior decision about the old rules versus the new rules. But those are the reasons, I believe, I wasn't here 22 years ago, that the then board carved out an exception for a merger of some other Class 1 with KCS, but not all, only some. But those are the reasons, I think, which underlay the board's decision to apply the old rules to this particular combination. I think as a pure factual matter, no other two Class 1s could possibly fit into that same factual pattern. And I'll just leave it at that. That's a factual statement and not a statement about what the board will do. Yes, ma'am.
Connie Snyder, Politico. Can you just say a little bit more about your decision-making process? Was
I wish I could.
was the board unanimous? Did you consult with DOT or DOJ? I know they had concerns.
We have a very rigorous and protected, as it should be, decision-making process. There was no board vote until 2 days ago. I know, and I saw some speculation of Wall Street observers that the board must have voted 2 months ago. It did not happen. It would have been a flagrant violation of the law, and we don't do any violations of the law, and certainly not flagrant ones. Under the Sunshine Act, now that the board has 5 members, 2 members can talk to each other in private and exchange views on a decision. Only 2, because it's not a quorum. There has been, since I have been chairman, on virtually every decision of import at this board, lengthy one-on-one conversations. That's how we usually decide cases. That's how I try to do my job as chairman. I describe it as fomenting consensus. You can take that to mean whatever you want it to mean. I chose the words carefully. This is a complicated decision. There's 175 pages. I can't tell you how many phrases and sentences were subject to negotiation to make sure that every board member's views were heard and considered. That's the same process we followed in this decision. And, you know, as a sentient human being, over the course of time, in all my discussions with individual board members, a sense of where we're going emerges, but not a vote. Because at some point, the staff has to write this decision. You can't take a vote and say, churn out a 175-page decision tomorrow. So we discuss various matters. The staff gets a general idea of where what board members' views are, and then tries to write it up in a way that reflects those views. I want to emphasize a couple of things which I've often said about this board. This is a spectacular group of people. You can leave me out of that if you want. They're independent, they're very smart, they're thoughtful, they're knowledgeable, and they all make a contribution. And in my view, at least since I've been chairman, we get better decisions through this process of consensus building. I don't have all the answers. In fact, I have almost none of the answers. And so that's the process we followed, and that is the basis of why I think we have a great decision here. It was not unanimous. We have generally been able to act unanimously. my dear friend Robert Primus, who is a very smart and thoughtful board member, came to a different conclusion and wrote a dissent. That is not only his right, but that's his obligation as a member of this board to express his views. And I respect those views. I don't agree with them in this case. But he was part of our constructive discussions over the last 2 years. So that was the process. And we finally, and you could not know the answer to this until the final vote came in Monday. It was going to be 4-1, 3-2, or to be defeated. I mean, I had a pretty good idea, but I didn't know. In terms of timing, just so you all know, and I don't understand this, but I'll tell you what staff tells me. When we issue a decision, after it's written and voted on, it has to go through what's called a clearance process. One of my trusty aides will tell you what that means, but it's mostly technical formatting by other members of the staff. It is a very time-consuming process. So for a 5-page decision, we can do it in a couple hours. For a 175-page decision, it took from midday Monday until last night at 5, which is why we released it this morning. That's the only thing that was happening going through this formatting. Is that a correct way to say it? It's more than formatting, isn't it? Close enough. So no, I haven't. Has anybody on Zoom tried to weigh in here? Or
We're gonna move to questions online now.
oh, I see. You mean you were holding these people off? That wasn't fair.
We have- Are we all, we're good? Okay.
Yeah, but let me say this, nobody's cut off. So,
No.
you know, I'm here as long as you need me. Okay. Who's up?
We go to Kaylin from Southeast Iowa Union.
Yeah, hello. So I understand why the oversight is like needed because you got a lot of public feedback asking for that kind of oversight, right? But what makes it necessary to do, you know, this much? This is the longest oversight period ever required. Like, what made that so important in this case of this merger?
Good question. If I had been here for earlier mergers, I probably would have moved for longer oversight periods then. You know, I think the conduct of the rail industry in general, not so much CP and KCS in particular, has shown me as a board member that detailed oversight and reporting is essential. I think the board as a general proposition needs to toughen up its oversight of this industry. You know, all the hearings we had last year about service meltdowns and embargoes, none of which, by the way, affected CP and KCS, but affected the other large railroads, showed me that in general, we need to really keep track of what's going on and be ready to act. So that is what really informed the longer oversight period and the very, very detailed reporting requirements so we can measure what's happening.
All right, next we're gonna move to Ari of Journal of Commerce.
Hello, this is Ari Ash from the Journal of Commerce. Two, if I could squeeze in, hopefully, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So the first part I wanted to ask was there were references on page 27 and 142, some claims and a petition from the Federal Maritime Commission saying that, you know, their argument was that this would hurt U.S. ports and U.S. longshoremen and U.S. rail workers. So I wanted to get your sense to what extent was this decision taken through the prism of what's best for North America versus sort of the prism of what's best for the United States, and any messages you might have for Commissioners Bensel, Sola, and Vekich, who I know you work closely with on many issues. And then my second question is about Chicago, if the team will allow me to do a follow-up.
I will, but let me try to answer this one first so I don't forget it. First of all, congratulations on getting to pages 27 and 142. You're way ahead of me. You know, competition in the rail industry is good. To the extent that this merger will enhance CP's ability to deliver intermodal traffic from St. John and from Vancouver, couple of aspects. It's not exactly like during the pandemic, the US ports were functioning well. Every American US citizen could have benefited from better movement of goods from the ports. So I think that is part of the public benefit for the country to have more access. But it would be my hope and my answer to the commissioners. The real answer is what we said in our decision. But I would make the observation that hopefully this will cause the US railroads to up their games at our US ports. And I would make this observation about these railroads. This is my observation. But one of my frustrations is that there has not been a lot of entrepreneurial energy in the Class 1 railroads. I've talked about it at length. I spoke about it at Rail Trends last fall. CP has been very entrepreneurial. CP, since I've been on the board, bought a short line railroad through Maine to get to the port of St. John to stimulate container traffic from the Atlantic. CP entered a joint venture with Maersk to enhance the movement of containers off the port of Vancouver. You did not, until very recently, see that kind of energetic activity among the big US railroads. Finally, this past year, BN, after struggling for years, and certainly during the pandemic with the port of LA Long Beach, announced that it was going to make an investment at a intermodal yard ramp in Barstow, California. Thank you. It's overdue. Welcome to the game. On the East Coast, it was the Port of Savannah, not the railroads, that stimulated the development of 5 pop-up yards to move containers off the ports. Then CSX and NS said, fine, we'll come along. Why weren't they initiating that development? So I would hope that to the extent intermodal traffic is stimulated from the ports in Canada and the port in Mexico, it will stimulate these American railroads to get into the game at a more vigorous level, and we'll all be better off. Ultimately, the US public will benefit from more competitive forces. And this is one of the examples of why I think putting these two railroads together will be a stronger competitive force, which will benefit our entire economy. To quote our president, a statement with which I heartily agree, capitalism without competition is exploitation, I believe is his phrase. And we want more competition, and this will provide it. And I do not think we need to be so parochial as to say, well, it's going to cost jobs. It shouldn't cost jobs. It should add jobs. And in fact, this merger will add jobs, as I pointed out, in the United States itself. So that's the answer to question number 1. What's the question?
My follow-up, and then I'll obviously leave it to other reporters in the queue, is you mentioned Metra, several times in Chicago. I know you have obviously Chicago roots. I wanted to ask from like the positive perspective. So you referred to sort of the embargoes. Intermodal had a lot of problems in 21 and 22 in Chicago. To what extent could there possibly be a relief in Chicago in future surges where perhaps more cargo goes to Bensonville and Schiller Park and eases the congestion on places like Logistics Park Chicago and Global 4, facilities that certainly had a lot of problems with the stuff that was flooding through the West Coast?
Well, I was all ready to say thank you for that question. Metra is the only railroad I actually know anything about because I was chairman for a while. But then you threw at me all these operational freight questions, which I can't directly answer. I don't think, Ari, that those particular movements, maybe they were specifically analyzed. I don't have those in my head at the moment. I think the potential for a more efficient use of the Chicago terminal will be there. And I think one of the reasons CP is reorganizing how it's using Bensonville Yard and some of its other resources may lead to that. We analyzed the impact of the merger in terms of, was it going to have a negative interference with Metra's operations? And we concluded that based on the data at hand, as of today, it would not. But I think you raise a good point. I can't directly comment on it. If staff has some more information on that question that they analyzed, we will get it to you after after this press conference. But as long as you brought up Metro, I would like, because you are correct, I'm from Chicago, I'm still from Chicago. I've had a lot of input from folks concerned about the best interests of Metro, particularly on the question of transferring the dispatching rights from CP back to Metro on a line which Metro really owns, but in the bankruptcy reorganization 40 years ago, the then bankruptcy trustee contracted away those dispatching rights. We have decided in this decision that we are not going to order the transfer of those dispatching rights because we do not think the data requires it or supports it, and it would cause us to, in effect, break a contract. However, that request for relief, as well as any other requests affecting the Chicago area, are part of our oversight. And if it turns out, contrary to the supposition of your question, that maybe this will actually be an improvement, if it turns out that there is meaningful problems for Metro, that possibility, as well as all the other conditions that were asked for, remain on the table. So I don't know if that answer, I wish I could give you more of an answer to your other intricate question of the interoperation of the Chicago terminal, but I can't.
Are we gonna move to Esther of Wall Street Journal?
Hi, thanks.
Yeah.
My question is about a point raised by the one board member who dissented, Mr. Primus.
Yes.
He mentioned, and I quote, the unhindered cost cutting permitted by concentration of market power can have safety consequences for communities and railroad employees. Can you shed some light if there was a discussion about this among the board members?
There was discussion generally about safety. I can tell you in general, not about this merger. Robert is absolutely right in my view. I have been, well, the railroads would say hammering, so I'll use their word, the railroads for the entire time I've been on the board, and certainly last year, about the cost cutting and the 1/3 reduction in workforce that I believe has greatly caused a deterioration in service, and undoubtedly has some impact on safety because many of the people cut, carmen and yards and so forth, are involved in safety inspections. The specific impact on safety is the FRA's jurisdiction, and we did not study that with that kind of precision that the FRA is expected to do. But there was no indication in this application and in the data we reviewed that that kind of cost cutting and further reduction in workforce was going to take place in this merger. In fact, the data shows that the workforces will be increased. So I share Robert's general concern and the general fear of the monopolists, the other large monopolists and duopolists in the industry having really cut their resources over the years. But I don't think that concern was documented in this merger transaction.
Let's go to Tom Black of Bloomberg.
Hello, this is Tom Black with Bloomberg. Most of my questions have been answered, but I did want to ask about train length. Is this something that the board is looking at from an operational aspect? And it probably has safety implication as well. Is there anything that the board is looking at and maybe planning to do there?
You're talking about in general, Tom, outside this?
Yes.
There is nothing pending before the board on that now. I think it's an open question of whether Congress authorized the board to regulate train length. Generally on the question of safety, that is in the jurisdiction of the FRA. And I know people have talked to the FRA on that subject, but there is no pending matter right now dealing with train length in and of itself.
Okay, thank you.
I will say this, it comes up indirectly in terms of many of the discussions that we've had at board hearings about the whole PSR concept actually interfering with good service. In some cases, because of train length, from when we hear about it, it's not so much about safety as it is about trains being too long for the networks that they ride on. In other words, there aren't enough sidings for long trains to move over and let other trains through. So we get input like that in our oversight hearings, but we have no pending matter to deal with the issue directly.
Joanna from Freightwaves.
Hi, yes, you've touched on this a little bit already, but is there anything that you or your board members have learned through this proceeding that might inform how you look at the other proceedings that you have ahead of you? Or, as you examine, the any other shipper issues that come up?
Good question. One of the things I think we've all learned is to try to do this quicker. It's a long, tedious process to get it right. I'm only going to speak for myself. And this goes a little bit to the question that was asked about gateways involving other railroads. It was extremely enlightening to me to hear all the arguments back and forth from other railroads about competitive access that they'd like to have here, but they aren't willing to give in their own railroads. And it enlightened me about the various forces further than we'd already studied, the opportunities for improved competitive access and competition. And so I do think it adds to my knowledge, perhaps to the institutional perspective on dealing with these issues as we go forward. I couldn't be more specific than that. But it really, when you have to consider all the competitive aspects, pro and con, in a significant merger like this, if you're doing your job, you really have to weigh in granularly to what this all means. And it does add to our perspective and insights, I think, in a positive way.
Let's go to Marnie at the Daily Herald.
Marnie, my old friend, how are you?
Hi, Chairman. How are you?
Good.
Thanks for taking my question. I'm going to try to squeeze in a couple.
Okay.
The data reporting requirements for CP, will those include crossing delays and will those be made public?
Okay, good question. So let me, so give me an opportunity, Marnie, to give everybody notice. I'm hoping we can post something on this with page numbers so you don't have to memorize it. But throughout the decision, we discuss in some detail the reporting requirements for each kind of issue that's raised. And I could give you all the page numbers. It's a little tedious, but if you want them, the gateway reporting conditions are discussed at pages 80 to 83. The customer experience reporting issues are at 141 to 142. The operational data reporting, which I think we'll get to your question, Marnie, and I'll come back to it, are discussed at pages 106 to 108. And the Metra reporting requirements are discussed at pages 119 to 120. And then Appendix B has all of these reporting requirements listed. Two things. We are ordering CP and KCS to meet with the board's technical staff for a technical conference within 45 days, 60 days after the effective date of the decision. 30? 60 days from Monday, 30 days after the effective date, which is in 30 days, to iron out the actual logistics of the record keeping and the reporting. So we get what we want and we get it in a format that's usable. Unless any of this data is considered proprietary, I think, staff, correct me if I'm wrong, and CP says we need a protective order, the data will be publicly available. So did you want to know the specific?
I was wondering if there's going to be included with the data reporting would be crossing delays, number of
I'm looking at the Metro and the Chicago Communities language pages, which is discussed at 119.20. Weekly average transit times between two towers, which I won't bore the crowd with, you can read it. The number of trains per day, for the different lines that have been discussed, the Benson Field Yard, the Tower A5 and so forth. The weekly percentiles of maximum train lengths, the weekly number of trains, if any, over 10,000 feet. I don't know that there's actually quite a bit when you look at the Metro section. I don't know that if it measures blockage. If it doesn't, one of the reasons is that it doesn't. But blockage of crossings is not something within the unique knowledge of the railroad. We all know what that is. And I think the villages involved, they don't need me to urge them, but I would urge them to measure the blocking, the times that crossings are blocked on their own and report it to us. In fact, that would be an advantage. And this has happened in the past, you know, when we had complaints about the EJ&E transaction years ago, affected villages did not hesitate to send us their own measurement of block crossings. But that is not something that is unique to the railroads that they have to keep track of.
Thank you. And there's, I believe there's been community liaisons that are going to be appointed in the case of Chicago and Houston, I think, to meet with local leaders. Can you what do these people, can you describe their jobs and, how much authority do they have to, address people's concerns?
Well, only the board ultimately has authority to address concerns. I think that requiring the railroad to have a liaison in place whose job it is to facilitate communications, receive concerns, and attempt voluntarily to work them out will incentivize the railroads to do that in good faith. And if they're not doing it, we'll be on top of it. So just putting these people in place should have an amelioratory effect. And I'm actually optimistic that it will allow many of these problems to be worked out. The board works out problems with railroads every day on an informal basis, very, very successfully. But having the liaison and have the community right there to be able to communicate directly with the railroad, it is a great addition. Some of the complaints that we get at the board, and I'm sure you've heard over time, is that an unhappy citizen can't even get somebody at the railroad on the phone. This will be a person whose assignment is to be there and be available. So I think it's a more for purposes of voluntarily resolving disputes and a facilitation of communication and making sure the board knows what's going on.
Thank you. And then just real quick, I know the report said that, it was the board found Metro's concerns about, train lengths and delays, unpersuadable. And therefore you have put in place a dispute resolution mechanism, which it's complicated. It sounds like it's got to be triggered by 2/4 of 5% delays of 6 minutes. Can Metra have confidence that, if they're starting to see a lot of problems that, it would be swiftly addressed?
A couple of responses, and I think maybe you just accidentally misspoke. We didn't say it was unpersuadable. We're very persuadable. We said their argument was unpersuasive.
Thank you.
And we very seriously took into account Metra's concerns about the data and their RTC study. And we constructed it and deconstructed it. And we concluded that, and I love Metra for many reasons, including the people who still work there. But we found that their point just wasn't supported by the data. And in fact, they had some incorrect data in their RTC study. And we spelled out why. If anything, that will be instructive, I think, to Metra going forward, if it needs to report to us the kind of data we need to hear if a problem arises. But I think it's a four-tiered, isn't it, a four-tiered resolution process for disputes is aimed at getting this. It's very complex and time-consuming if people have to bring their problems directly to the board. We have many legal processes for due process reasons and so forth that are required. So in every situation, we do our best to stimulate the parties involved to get these matters resolved. By setting up this 4-tiered resolution process, it really should stimulate the parties working these things out together. Now, remember, and I'm going from memory now, some 6 years ago, or however long ago it was that I left Metra. CP and Metra have been operating over those same lines for decades. And Metra, when I was there, I think it's still true, had the best on-time performance record in the country, including on those lines. So yes, there are frustrations, there always are when railroads have to work together. But generally, Metra service has been successful on the CP lines because they are able to work things out, and that was without a formal resolution process. So I would anticipate that formalizing it and having us monitoring it now in a way that was never there before, if anything, will improve Metra and CP's abilities to play nicely together. And that is what I expect. And if they don't, we'll
Thank you.
We'll make them. Was that it, Marnie?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Tanya.
Just wanted to ask if you said that 2 days ago was the first time you could have possibly taken the vote.
No, it's the first time we did take the vote.
Oh, okay.
30 days after February 3rd was what the statute prevented us from acting until 30 days after the EIS was done and posted at the EPA, which was February 3rd.
Oh, okay.
So that would be 25 and 5. No, yeah, March 7th. Thank you. That was the first day we could have voted.
I think my question was whether all of the attention on freight rail recently, the East Palestine incident, had impacted the timing of your decision at all.
It did not. It impacted my timing to respond thoughtfully to all of the letters we received. And it impacted my thought processes so I could come here this morning and explain what the facts on the ground are in terms of rail safety. It did not impact the timing of the decision. Janie?
Sarah at Supply Chain Dive.
Hi, Chairman. Thank you so much for taking my question and for staying for so long. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the data requirements. The STB has required the other 4 Class 1 carriers in the US to submit more expanded data around last mile, first mile, last mile, et cetera. But this new system wouldn't really be required to have those same expanded data requirements unless something goes wrong in terms of service and the STB has to go back. Can you just explain the decision-making process of like why not ask for the data now and why wait until there's a disruption?
Well, it's a good question. You know, you could say that about almost any aspect of rail service. We have an enormous amount of data gathering that's been in place for a number of years, even before last year. The service meltdown of the 4 large US railroads, which led to our hearings last April, and the subsequent reporting order with additional reporting requirements and the service recovery plans, was specifically designed to get at the problems which those 4 railroads were suffering and which came out at the hearings. So they were finally attempted to finally tune those data reporting requirements of the service recovery plan. I don't think it's useful either for a proper expenditure of government resources or burdens on industry to just sort of have a free floating data requirements that don't relate to something that's specifically in front of us. In all of our monitoring of service last year, CP and KCS were not the problem makers. And they, along with CN, were not subject to those additional reporting requirements, and they still aren't, at least to the degree that the other 4 railroads were. In fact, I would note, and it was a note I wanted to double check this morning, and wasn't directly related to those additional service reporting, but this does relate to the hearings we had last year and are still looking at involving the use of embargoes. While the Union Pacific had 1,100 embargoes last year, Canadian Pacific had 0, and KCS had 12. So these are the better actors in terms of service on a comparative basis, and therefore they were not subject to those extra reporting requirements. But because we're in a merger situation which allows more detailed oversight, we wanted to acknowledge the potential for a service problem. There have been service problems in previous mergers, the famous UP-SP meltdown, for which I was not here. We don't anticipate, because of the nature of these two networks coming together, anything like that. But if anything even close to it emerges, we will require a service plan, and we will undoubtedly require more reporting. But it just isn't warranted on this record. Did that answer your question? You're gone. Okay, must have.
Let's move to Mike of E&E News.
Hi, thanks for taking the question. I wanted to follow up on the environmental benefits you mentioned. Is there any requirement in the deal to monitor the emissions reductions or the number of trucks taken off the highway or anything like that? And is there any provision in the oversight period to go back and maybe ask for more environmental fixes?
Well, it's not. We don't have the expertise or facilities to measure emissions. That's the EPA and other government agencies. But we are specifically monitoring conversion of truck to rail, as well as from other railroads to rail. So yes, we will be able to determine if the promised conversion, and it won't happen overnight, it will take some time, of 64,000 trucks from highway to rail is taking place. And then you can extrapolate generally, because there's a great deal of data of how much more stuff trucks put into the air than trains. Whatever that number is, we did calculate that those 64,000 trucks that will be absent would have generated 127,000 tons of CO2. So we'll have that kind of monitoring, but we're not going to measure whether any particular diesel locomotive is putting out too much stuff, if that's what you're asking.
Right. And do you have any authority in the oversight period to go back and make any changes to get more trucks off the road?
We have authority to do anything that the merger events cause as a problem. And yes, as under the oversight period, if problems arise resulting from the merger, that's why we're having an oversight period. And we will have authority to deal with it. I can't answer the question in the abstract beyond that.
Bill Stevens, Trains Magazine, you're up. And then after this, I'm going to go to WLF, ABC Chicago, and then Ari, I'll come to you after that.
Hello, Bill. Bill, unmute yourself. Mouse isn't working.
Let's move to WLS ABC Chicago.
All right, and Bill, we'll get back to you.
John?
Yeah, thank you very much. John Garcia with WLS TV Chicago.
Hi, John.
Thank you very much for taking our so much time here. Just wondering to what extent, if any, the concerns of some of the first responders, police and fire, who testified that they would be delayed, that they would lose precious minutes trying to get around lowered gates from some of these extended trains that they're concerned about. To what extent, if any, was that a consideration for the board?
A definite consideration. I attended the hearing in Itasca and listened to all of the first responders who were there. And I know you didn't mean to say they were going to try to get around the lowered gates. You meant they were right. Nobody should do that. You know, the data, I understand their fears. I would have those fears too. They're real fears. But we have look, the Chicago terminal is the largest I think in the continent, but certainly in the United States. Over 1,300 trains go through that terminal every day. And we all function. And there are some delays. There aren't that many that are causing disasters that I am aware of. We're not going to eliminate the Chicago terminal. It is the centerpiece of the American economy. So we have to measure the impact of this merger on the system that we have. And while the fears are legitimate, and I think some people had been given information that was just not accurate, and it understandably caused their fears to be increased. But we did measure it specifically. And in the communities that we're talking about, where those concerns were voiced, the average train length will increase by about 10 cars. That is just a few seconds if the train is going at the appropriate speed through the crossing. So it, you know, the combined mayors of the western suburbs asked us to impose about $9 billion in expenditure by CP to build overpasses at virtually every crossing. But that is simply not the real world, and it isn't going to happen. And it isn't warranted. It wouldn't be a cost-effective expenditure of that money, even if the money was available. But the data show that it isn't necessary. However, if a problem were to arise, if the projections, this is what I've been talking about all morning, turn out not to come to fruition, and there are blockings which are causing a serious public health problem, that is why we have the oversight period. That is why we will have the authority to order further mitigation if the facts on the ground require it. So we will be there. And I'm comfortable assuring all of those first responders that if they can demonstrate the problems to us, we will do everything under the sun to solve the problem.
Thank you, sir.
Let's go back to Ari.
What happened to Bill?
We're gonna try it again.
Okay.
So following up sort of on the last answer on what happens if some of these concerns are valid, in a couple parts of your decision, you essentially said the concerns of BNSF and UP in regards to the interchange in Laredo and Robstown in terms of the rates is speculative. There was also a claim that you guys rejected from Norfolk Southern Railway in regards to the Meridian Speedway and potentially adverse impact on intermodal shippers. And you guys said that that was speculative as well. If it turns out either one of those concerns may have more validity over the next 7-year review period, what mechanisms are there for BNSF, for Union Pacific, for Norfolk Southern to say to you guys, yeah, there's a problem here that's adversely impacting, you know, for the purposes of my readers, intermodal shippers in the Meridian Speedway or Robstown or Laredo?
Well, first, let me amend, I think, part of your question, or at least from my point of view. All of the concerns are valid, particularly the ones from the community that we were just talking about with the last questioner. The concerns are valid, but the question is, are they proven to warrant action? So you lumped in a number of different concerns, and let me try to talk about the ones I can remember. BN in particular complained about the potential for being foreclosed at Laredo. But as we pointed out, in the time that KCS bought the Mexican Railroad and the same concerns were raised, there hasn't been one complaint brought to KCS or to the board about anybody being foreclosed at Laredo. And BN moved a lot of its traffic to Eagle Pass, and their concerns were, charitably put, overstated. I would say the same about UP. It's not like these railroads have a great record themselves of opening themselves up to competitive access. As to the Meridian Speedway, CSX came in here and asked us to undo a board decision approving the joint, I guess what is essentially a joint venture between NS and KCS that was 10 years old, 20 years old, that had nothing to do with this merger. I mean, that horse was out of the barn. It was really, I thought, I'll speak for myself, inappropriate in the context of this merger. Likewise, NS and KCS had a well-constructed contractual arrangement for the operation of the Meridian Speedway, and NS wanted us to remake the contract for them. There was no basis to credit any of the fears that those railroads expressed in any of these areas. During the oversight period, if there is foreclosure, then we will be in a position to act. I want to point out, as I have been educated in my time at the board, that we are here to protect competition, not competitors. So the enforcement of the gateway protections as it relates to foreclosure are limited to being brought to us by the individual shipper who is being foreclosed. A carrier cannot come in here and say my shipper is being foreclosed. They would not have standing to do that. However, there is a commitment by CP and a condition in the order that the division of rates between carriers has to be appropriate. And carriers can come in here and seek relief if there is a problem with the division of rates. I do want to point out that one of the monitoring requirements will be a regular reporting on the count of cars being that are going through connected carriers at these interchange points. So we will know on our own whether there's some problem with foreclosure based on the car reporting that we will get, and we stand ready to act if necessary. But none of, when you really look what was going on, in my view, and I think we said so in our decision, the other large American class ones were either trying to do whatever they could to stymie this merger, I think because they feared the competition. That's a pretty good measure of whether this will enhance competition or at least be a stronger competitive force, I suppose is a more accurate way to state it. And or to just get a big piece of CP KCS's pie for themselves. Not something they would offer in reverse. Yes.
A question about DOJ. Does DOJ need to take a look at this merger in any sense or get involved in any way? Or is this a case where it's just STB and DOJ has no jurisdiction here?
Well, I can't answer the question of what DOJ needs to do because that is up to DOJ. So there's several aspects of your question. As a matter of what Congress has set up here, unlike other other industries, the STB has sole jurisdiction to approve or disapprove of this merger. DOJ, by statute, is automatically a party to merger cases in front of the board. So they can, and they in fact have filed briefs, both in the voting trust and most recently on the merits. And we pay close attention to what they say. They are antitrust experts. But there is a big difference between DOJ's reviews of mergers on the mergers that it has jurisdiction over and our review. We are an ongoing regulatory agency. We are staffed. We'd like to have more, and we will get more, but we are staffed to perform these ongoing oversight functions. After a merger happens, the railroads are still there. They're still serving shippers. They're still engaged in hazardous material transport and so forth. That's what we do here. The DOJ isn't set up to provide ongoing oversight. It is a big difference between we deal with, and I believe a big difference of why Congress assigned the merger review to us in the railroad industry, because it is so unique. The DOJ enforces the Clayton Act. We do not. Clayton Act does not apply to railroads. So and that is a big difference statutorily, because in our statute, as I said right at the outset, we are required in considering a merger to consider the adequacy of the transportation network. That's not in the Clayton Act. in addition to competition. So there are many differences between the DOJ's role in the merger world and our role. Whether DOJ needs to or wants to take any further action is up to them. We are by law an independent agency, and if anybody is independent, it's at DOJ, and I would not presume to observe what their action is or should be. I don't want to forget Bill Stevens, though.
Bill is gone. His question was answered. So we're good.
I don't even know what it was. How can I razz him about it?
That's what you said. So good.
Okay.
The STB's review obviously only applies into the US, but this is the first true North American railroad. Did the board take into consideration the fact that the railroad will be operating in Canada all the way through Mexico? 2, is there anything in the decision or that the STB has in the works to work with its fellow agencies in Canada and Mexico? Because things that happen in Mexico, especially in terms of service, can affect it the rest of the way. Like there were several protests in Mexico over the last few years that blocked a major part of KCSM line. And that could obviously result in significant delays or congestion reversing into the US and Canada.
Good question. I thought you were going to say the things that happen in Mexico stay in Mexico, but they don't. So it's a very good question. We do not have jurisdiction over railroad operations outside the United States. That's sort of an obvious point of our, the fact that we're a separate country. We are cognizant of the economic impact of having this single line service from Canada to Mexico through the United States. And we made some observations about that in our decision, that the single line service, I think, will be a great benefit to the US economy and to commerce. That is one of the strong public benefits to this merger and really offsets many of the other concerns. It will be a plus. By moving the tremendous amount of grain that goes from the United States into Mexico on single line service, it's going to go there faster, hopefully cheaper, hopefully more competitive with other railroads that go to Mexico. Moving automobile parts back and forth between the United States and automobile factories in Detroit and in Canada will facilitate commerce on single line, more efficient service. So yes, we were very cognizant of the economic benefits to this country by having this railroad come into existence, which does not exist, has not existed before. In terms of our counterparts, we have, I wouldn't call them regular, but very friendly and positive relationships and communications with the rail authorities in Canada and the rail authorities in Mexico. Interestingly enough, there have been very minor matters that I can't even think of more than one that have affected the need for us to actually interact regularly with those agencies in terms of a railroad issue. But we have good relationships. And I think if a problem arose, there would be every opportunity to work those out. Janie actually may have more history of communications with those other agencies, but I wouldn't anticipate any problems, but I wouldn't anticipate much need either.
I just wanted to circle back to your comment about the role of the STB as the ongoing regulator of the rail industry. You mentioned that the rail industry is Clayton Act, but I wanted to ask about the Sherman Act, whether you think it's appropriate for the rail industry to be exempt from antitrust enforcement from, say, state attorneys general or the DOJ when any type of conduct outside of the commercial context.
So I have the great advantage of having my own attorney advisor, being an antitrust lawyer. I am not an antitrust lawyer. I have learned over the long years I practice law not to venture into legal opinions in areas that I don't practice in. But Jetta Sandin is telling me now that railroads are not exempt from the Sherman Act. Is that correct? So, and I rely on Jetta and you rely on me, so you should rely on Jetta. On the general question, however, that you ask about should railroads otherwise be exempt and should state attorney generals be jumping in to bring antitrust suits, you know, there is a broad preemption provision in our statute, which is a very important policy matter, which the Congress realized. I can't tell you the year, but they started regulating railroads in 1887 when they created Interstate Commerce Commission. And it should be obvious to anybody who thinks about it that in order to have a successful economy, we are one nation. Railroads cross every state and they take goods back and forth. And if you started having local officials all over the country with their own regulations, whether they were antitrust enforcement or crossing standards or any other carload standards, you could not have a functioning rail system. So as a broad matter, it is not in the country's interest to localize regulation of railroads. That's been decided for a long time. As to the future regulatory structure of the railroad industry, it needs work, but it needs work at the national level. And I think I'll leave it at that. It's something I may talk more about later this year. Is that it? And my friends from Channel 11 in Chicago didn't have a question. Hi, Channel 11. All right, well, listen, thank you all for listening to me. I think you have learned that as long as you want to keep me up here, I'll keep talking. So I'm glad you're letting me go. We appreciate your attendance, and I certainly am available, as is our public office, if you have follow-ups or other questions. I am hoping on this one document on where all the gateway requirements are in this long document that we can provide you with those page numbers where you'll find them. So other than, was it Ari who got to page 142? I don't know that the rest of you have. So we're going to try to make it easier for you. But once you get through it, don't hesitate. Really, it's in our interest for you and the public to understand what we did and why. So thank you very, very much, Paul. See you in the future.